Financial planning and security can sometimes be seen as a moving target. The rules change constantly, and you need guidance to stay ahead of the market moves. This is the Lebenthal Report with Michael Hartzman and Dominic Tavella. We'll break down the news, trends, and overall direction of the markets, telling you what may be coming next, investment opportunities, and what to avoid. Now, here are your hosts, Dominic Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is Tuesday, July 5th, 2022, and I'm on, as always, with my partner, Dominic Tavella. How are you, Dominic?
Doing well, Mike, coming out of the holiday weekend, 4th of July holiday weekend. Hopefully yours was as pleasant as mine, and now right back to the grind.
Not right back to reality. And, we have another consumer price index coming up. I think it's next week on the 13th, Dominic, and it's Groundhog Day. Because we have good days and bad days in the market, and everything seems to be leading up to whether inflation is cooling off or getting hotter or staying the same. So I feel like we've been in this endless loop for several weeks now, and something's got to break that cycle eventually, Dom.
And Mike, I would argue for 6 months, this has been the worst 6 months start to a year since believe dating back to the 70s.
The 70s. Yes.
And as you said, Mike, it's all about inflation and now the real fear that the Federal Reserve will have to continue raising interest rates aggressively and more likely than not push us into a recession. So now this question of corporate earnings and profits comes in. So yeah, we're on a negative cycle right now. This next inflation number probably is not going to be that great, but then I hope the numbers start to improve. So that's short-term, our view. Short-term, probably not that great news, but hopefully as we get into the latter part of this year, we get better and better news.
You know, we were cautiously optimistic last month, and the number was a disaster, and the market paid the price. And look, no one knows from day to day, week to week, obviously, but you're right. If that number is not great, the market might reflect that again. So hold on to your hats, because this bumpy ride is not over by a long shot.
Look, Mike, I again, just one man's opinion, but I don't think we're through this bumpy ride for a long while. But remember, every crisis also has an equal amount of opportunity. We have a considerable amount of liquidity cash sitting in our client portfolios. And that means the opportunity, perhaps at some point, to acquire some really high quality, strong companies at very, very discounted prices. So I know it's kind of hard to look at, a hard pill to swallow, especially with the quarterly statements coming out. But there is eventually a light at the end of the tunnel. And for us, an opportunity to buy things at a really deep discount.
Yeah, Dom, and it's hard to tell what it means, but normally before a long weekend, especially in the summer, you wouldn't be surprised to see the market sell off a little bit. And the market surprisingly rallied Friday afternoon, into a long weekend. And then today, again, the market was down most of the day, and the NASDAQ actually closed up. I think the S&P closed up. The Dow closed down a little bit. So, maybe there's some signs of optimism that we are reaching for a bottom.
Look, Mike, I talked about the amount of liquidity that we have in our client accounts, which is just extraordinary. But when you look at the markets overall, the amount of cash sitting on the sidelines is just enormous. And people like ourselves and other money managers, they want to put this money to work. They want to buy these companies that are on sale. But we do have some data, some noise, as we've talked about in some of our past shows, that is coming out. I think the prudent thing to do is just be careful here. Just, better to be a little safe than sorry. There'll be plenty of buying opportunities over the next month or two. I think there'll be plenty of good buying opportunities. And then hopefully we rally into the end of the year.
And again, not to sound like a broken record, but I do think, and you and I have talked about this, a lot, once we get clear indication, it's going to be more than one print, but once we get a clear indication that inflation is calming down or rolling over, whatever euphemism you want to use, I do think there'll be some relief, right? A relief rally. And here's the other part of it, Dom. you and I were pretty convinced that we were not going to have a recession this year. And now there's a little bit more talk that we might actually be in a recession, and we will not know that for several weeks. And a part of me saying, well, if we're going to have a recession, let's rip the Band-Aid off and let's just kind of get it done with.
Yeah, Mike, I know you've brought this up in some of our past podcasts, but, technically, if this quarter happens to end up, this past quarter, the second quarter, happens to be negative, well, wham, we are in a recession. I mean, you wake up tomorrow morning, theoretically, we were in a recession. Who knew, right? So recession means different things, different times. Right now, the unemployment numbers are exceedingly good. We get a number on Friday again. Wages, all the things that people are living on the financial side are pretty healthy. On the spending side, it's where we're feeling the pain, right? So recession, at the end of the day, we may actually have gone through it or will go through it and not even know. I think more important, we want to look at where are we in this economic cycle, and hopefully the Fed doesn't have to push the brakes too hard and slow the economy too much.
Right. And again, that's to be continued. We're not going to know for several weeks. But what I am going to bring you back to the comment you made, how the market hasn't been this bad since the 70s, at least the start of the year hasn't been this bad to the 70s, which is a great segue, because I guess tonight's show is going to have a little bit of a 70s theme, because we have the opportunity tonight to have Coach Ray Scott, who was a player for the Detroit Pistons in the 60s and 70s. And in 1974, I believe it was, he was the first African-American to win Coach of the Year for the NBA. He recently wrote a book called The NBA in Black and White, the Memoir of a Trailblazing NBA Player and Coach. And we have the unique opportunity to have him for the entire show tonight, Dom. And I'm really anxious to get his opinion from a business point of view, and it's just his own insight of how the NBA has changed over the last 50 years.
And Mike, I know you're a big Knicks fan, so as I am. And you look at, free agency that we just went through, and you look at salaries and how much the players really control not only their destiny in terms of where they play, but the financial well-being that they're able to come into and the wealth they're able to create for themselves, their families. This is a tremendous story. So I'm very much looking forward to speaking to Coach Scott and his views on when he was a player compared to today, and even what a coach gets paid today compared to back in his time. I think it's relevant to the wealth planning process, but I think this will be a very interesting and fun conversation tonight.
Yeah, I don't think 45 minutes is going to be enough. So we'll get right to it right after this break, and we'll be right back with Coach Ray Scott.
Lebenthal.com. Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominic Tavella and our special guest this evening, Coach Ray Scott. Coach, how are you?
I'm terrific, guys, and it's so great to be with you.
Well, thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
So, Coach, I just have to jump off. I mean, you've had a great career. I spent a lot of this week reading about your background and all that you've accomplished. And one thing that just kind of gets slid into your bio is you were the fourth pick in the draft in 1961. I think the draft was 2 weeks ago, with all the pomp and circumstance and all that was written about it and all these kids. You were the fourth pick in the draft. What was that like back in 61?
Well, let me give you my pomp and my circumstance. It was so interesting because I come from an era where basketball, which was a sport that was invented for America in terms of professionals to show they're All-Americans. It was a college All-American sport. So everyone knew who they were, just fraught, like, who would our draft picks be? Who would who do we get? What All-American from what school? So here I come into this draft. I had dropped out of college and played my last 3 years in the Eastern League. And the draft is like very notable because what big man is there going to beat it? It's going to join Oscar Robertson, Elgin Baylor, Wilt Chamberlain, and Bill Russell, the four behemoths of basketball. And so everybody's looking for this player. And that player is the first player picked in 1961, Walter Bellamy, big Walt Bellamy from Indiana. So then they said, okay, now the Knicks pick. Who are the Knicks going to pick? And the Knicks had kind of had a little interest in me. Fuzzy Levain and Red Holtzman had scouted me and so forth. And so I said, it might not be the Knicks. But the Knicks picked Tom Stith from St. Bonaventure. Smart choice. Kid's a great player. He's from Harlem. Times there are changing. And so Ray Scott doesn't get picked by the Knicks. Third pick. I'm looking at these picks, by the way, as I'm riding on a Subway L up to the Bronx to play in a tournament. I took the train up from Philadelphia, got off at 34th Street, and you go downstairs and you get on the subway, and I'm going up north. And so I said, I'm going to get the paper and see, who was drafted this afternoon. Because remember, the pomp and circumstance of those days was the draft was held in the afternoon by phone.
Coach, was this even on the radio at the time? I mean, it's a big pomp and circumstance today.
By phone. So those two picks are made, and I had picked up a newspaper, and I'm looking at this newspaper, and I'm saying, oh my God, the two guys I picked, I'm not there. And I think it was the New York Post, which is a good newspaper at that time. So I'm looking in the Post, and the third player picked, I said, Cincinnati Royals. I had talked to their vice president, Pep Martin, and he said, we might have a little interest. But I knew they had Bob Boozer, and they had Jack Twyman and Wayne Embry. So they had a pretty, decent front court. But I said, I may get drafted. No, they picked Larry Siegfried from Ohio State. He played with Havlicek, Lucas, that great team that they had there. They were NCAA champions. So they picked Larry Siegfried. So now I said, oh, okay. Now I'm getting down to Detroit, and I got to turn the page or do all the stuff you do. And Detroit, I remember I said, well, Earl Lloyd told me and told my mom that the Pistons were going to pick me.
Earl Lloyd was the coach at the time, right?
Earl was the assistant coach to Dickie McGuire at the time, right? So, and he's the chief scout. He's the first chief scout, the first black assistant in the league. He's and he's probably one of the first assistants, because you didn't even have assistants in those days. And so Earl goes to, and Earl had convinced me as he came and visited that they were going to draft me. Well, I at this time, after New York and Cincy didn't take a flyer, I'm saying, well, I probably where I landed on the second round. Well, I'm looking at the paper, and it says Ray Scott, fourth player picked in America. In America, out of, and you remember, it's only 9 teams.
Right.
It's not like there's 30 teams. There's only 9 teams. So I said, oh my, and I let out a scream, guys. I mean, Mike, Dom, I screamed so loud that and everybody looked around and see who the heck screamed like that. And so being a South Philly kid, I figured things out pretty fast. I started looking around to see who screamed too. So they never figured it out that it was me by the time I got off, wherever I got off. But that's how I found out. That was my pomp and my circumstance. Now, the great part of it is they, of course, fly you out to sign you. Now we're talking money. Now, guys, imagine me flying out to Detroit, meeting Earl Lloyd, him taking me to a club, seeing that there was a 20 grand, and I'm seeing this great talent. I don't even know the shows that I saw, but it was so great. And he takes me to the club, takes me to dinner, and we get back to the hotel. And I said, Earl, I had dinner, but I forgot to order dessert. Do you think I could get an apple pie a la mode? And Earl looked at me and said, are you crazy? You're the #1 draft pick. You can order a whole nother meal again. And I just went through myself. I was like, yes, I made it. So now we're down to the meal. Next day contract. I go in for my contract, and I'm hoping that I can get in. Remember 5 digits, 10,000? I'm hoping I can get 10,000. Well, I walk out with a 2-year contract for 25,000. 1,000 of it is the bonus. Imagine flying home to had moved to West Philly, with $1,000 in my pocket.
Wow.
Now in today's money, that's like 100,000, but then it was $1,000, and I get a car, and I get a couple of suits, nice suits, and I still had money left over. That's what $1,000 did, and that was the bonus. But that was the money in that time. So I tell people I was born during my time to make it. You know, people say, "How about today? You're not you could be a millionaire." And I said, "That's great. That's great for the dream, but the reality is, this is when I was born. This was my time. The guys before me, think of Sweetwater Clifton with the Knicks, and Chuck Cooper with the Boston Celtics, and Earl Lloyd with the Syracuse Nats. They weren't making that kind of money. So I was blessed in my time. You can only be blessed in your time, not someone else's time. So I got this $25,000 contract from Mr. Zollner, and I got a raise every year, guys. And my goal, I was traded to the Baltimore Bullets. And one of the things they said when they traded for me, "What are your goals?" And I said, "Well, one of my goals was to make $20,000 a year." And they said, "Good, we're going to raise you to that."
Wow.
So then my next goal became financially. I said, before I leave the NBA, I want a contract for $50,000. I didn't set it up about watching anybody else, seeing what anyone else made. That was just my goals in terms of money and what I knew about money from my parents. So it was a very important time. But as you know, the 60s were really tumultuous. And making that kind of money had great bearing on where I was going as a person. And where it took me, where the NBA took me, was to exposure to a guy that could make decisions, but now I had money in my pocket. Prior, I didn't have enough money to buy a Philadelphia cheesesteak, you know, or have to borrow, or you know what I mean? But now I can buy a steak, I can go to a restaurant, I can buy my mother a gift. So those things changed in 1960. But remember, 1960 to me is buttressed by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, because he publicly said in 1960, when he was running for office, first Catholic, by the way, he said, "We want to include our Negro brethren in our society. We want to be inclusive, not exclusive." And I always felt in my heart of hearts that set the tone for not only society, but groups like the NBA, structures like the NBA. And the NBA began to bring in African-American kids in multiples of draft choices in the 1960s. That began to happen. So when that began to happen, life changes, but you're still observing what goes on within the primary structure, which is the United States of America. And I knew we were a problematic society because at 16, when I was an all-city player in Philadelphia, I had become aware of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. And yes, the murder was atrocious, but what really stuck in my mind, gentlemen, is the fact that he was only 14 years old. What is it that a 14-year-old kid could do that he should be summarily murdered? And so I started following that, and I voraciously read about it. It was a writer named Simeon Booker, and Simeon wrote in the Jet magazine. We had 2 big periodicals in the Black community, Jet magazine and Ebony magazine. Ebony was monthly, Jet was weekly. And Jet committed to following this case, a case of Emmett Till, every week, because being a weekly, you got pictures, you got thoughts, you got follow-ups. So that was really interesting to me. So that's what ushered me into the John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the JFK camp. That's what brought me there. And listening to him, and then the other leaders were just kind of emerging. Dr. King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and then you add in John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. But the guy that got it done, as much as I love the image of JFK, the guy that got it done was LBJ.
Yeah,
People forget that. In the South, he said, I want civil rights and I want voting rights. That was in 64 and 65. So think about all of this going on. As I'm playing basketball, and I'm playing obviously before spectators, not TV cameras, all of this is going on, and I'm a basketball player, but I'm observing what's going on in America.
So Coach, you as a player, you have this issue of, on a professional level, the leagues are integrating and you're getting paid for the quality of your play. And nobody cares about the color. Well, I shouldn't say, but the owners don't care about the color of your skin. They want you to play, right? And play well, and they're willing to pay you. But yet society is still way behind you in this discussion.
Well, I don't think we can make it that plaintive. And I'll tell you why. I had to play in St. Louis. And St. Louis was the Mississippi of the NBA. We couldn't eat in restaurants. We couldn't get service. You know, it was things were deplorable for us in St. Louis. And I started out there at 22 years of age. And as if my nightmare wasn't great enough on the one side, on the sociological side, then I got to go and guard Bob Pettit. So I got a double nightmare. Bob Pettit was one of the greatest players that ever played. He's 6'9", same height as me. Rangy, tough guy, shooter, just a great player. So my nightmare is great in St. Louis anyway, to begin with. When I land, I'm like, oh, I'm in Bob Pettit country. And, you know, it just always amazed in 9 cities, in the 9 cities they had. Each one of those cities had an incredibly great forward. Elgin Baylor in Los Angeles, Bob Pettit, who I named, Jack Twyman in Cincinnati. Then I got to go to New York, and there's Johnny Green. And they called him Jumping Johnny Green. And in those days, when they named somebody Jumping, you can figure out pretty quick what they could do. So they nicknamed Johnny Green. Then I got to go to Boston with Heinsohn. I got to go to Syracuse with Dalshays and wind up in Philadelphia with Paul Ireson. My life was full of nightmares. But I was making a living. I was learning the pro game, and I was learning America at the same time. So it was really just a great time. And in fact, I have to include in that, because you gentlemen are in New York, I got to play at the Mecca, Madison Square Garden. And we played many doubleheaders. We played the Knicks, and the Knicks were drafting at that time Willis Reed. They had Walt Bellamy. They had Jim Barnes, Jim Bad News Barnes, not the Marvin Bad News, because there's a lot. I guess Barnes was, they were bad news guys, but that was their front court in New York. And I was going through this, and oh man, this revelation. And I became a voracious reader. I just picked up books, and I loved reading, and started out with Baldwin and went to Richard Wright and Ernest Hemingway I wound up with, because I saw this great movie, A Farewell to Arms. So it was a great time as we were going through that tumultuous period in the United States of America. And I'm observing this from the seat of a professional basketball player. So gentlemen, I submit to you that is just a time I couldn't forget, and I'm fortunate enough to have written about it.
So, Coach, you know, I wanted to ask you about the Kevin Durant, you know, situations going on with the Brooklyn Nets, but we're coming up to a break, so I don't want to cut short that answer. So let me just ask you this. You know, Dominic and I grew up fans in the 70s, and we always heard that Bird and Magic saved the NBA. And you mentioned so many great players, so many Hall of Famers. Did Bird and Magic really have to save the NBA?
No, I don't think it was a mission. I think it was like those inadvertent periods you get into, right place, right time, right girl. You know, like they found the NBA at that period in the late 70s when the NBA was searching for a way to become national. Their name was the National Basketball Association, but we were really a Northeastern League. You know, Syracuse, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. That was where the primary interest in the league was, because there was Wilt and there was Russell. Those were the two guys. And so the interest in the league was kind of dominated by that area. Although we had a little juice on the West Coast with Elgin Baylor and Jerry West. So there was some interest, but there was no Magic and no Bird. This was a made-for-TV opera. One kid from Indiana, one kid's from Michigan. So they're rural kids.
And
they're
East Coast versus West Coast.
And it becomes East Coast, West Coast, and that's a natural for America. That's a natural. And
you summed that up. You summed that up perfectly, Coach, because that's been bugging me growing up, rooting for those guys in the 70s. And I'm thinking, what had to be saved? But you summed that up perfectly. So, Coach, we're running up against the break. So why don't we take a break now, and then we'll come back. And I want to ask you about the current, and Dominic and I want to ask you about the current NBA, if we can.
Sure.
We'll be right back.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominic Tavella and our coach for the evening, Ray Scott. Coach, I got to ask you a question. I know, the league has changed remarkably since then. I mean, they made a big deal back in 72 that you were the first Black coach to win Coach of the Year, right? I mean, people shouldn't make a big deal about those things anymore, right? If you earn it, you should win it. Doesn't matter the color of your skin. But now the players have gotten so much power that I just have to ask your opinion, because you were a player and you were in management. So a guy like Kevin Durant, who signs a 4-year contract and wants to be traded even before that contract goes into effect. And apparently the Nets are going to acquiesce. So what's your feeling? Do you feel the pendulum has swung too much, Coach, that the players almost have too much power?
Well, that's why we have pendulums. They're going to swing too much one way or the other. I come from the era where the owners had absolute control.
Right.
I was Kevin Durant. I'd be sending Oscar Robertson roses every day, because Oscar Robertson is the player that put his neck on the line so that the NBA players could get livable wages. And that was in 1966. Now, Tommy Heinsohn and Bob Cousy and some of their cohorts attempted a players association in 1962 at the All-Star game and said they were going to boycott the game. And the owners had absolute power and they broke that down. But in 1966, Oscar Robertson put together a group of which I was a member, along with Walt Bellamy, I think Don Nelson, Archie Clark. We had a good group, a good working group, and we wanted to put together the Players Union, and we hired an attorney by the name of Larry Fleischer. And so Larry Fleischer was going to be the operations guy to help put it together, and Oscar was going to be the players' brains behind it that drove it. He was the guy that was going to step in front of the owners and say, these are the things that we would like, these are the things that we have to have, and these are the things that should be decided today in this room. And Oscar did that, and he made such a great presentation that the new millionaires that were coming into the NBA, because prior to the NBA millionaires, the NBA was made up of promoters. And the promoters were worried about ice capades, what group was coming to sing, just booking the buildings that they were in. The owners owned it, and their decisions were absolute. So Jack Kid Cook, who at that time owned the Washington Redskins and the Los Angeles Lakers, Sam Shulman, Seattle, I think Eddie Gottlieb, Philadelphia, they were in the room. And we were allowed to make the presentation. And Oscar, but we couldn't bring our attorney. We could not bring an attorney. And Oscar was the guy that made a presentation that an attorney would make. And Jack Kent Cooke, if memory serves, turned to one of the other owners and said, this gentleman is a fine presentation. And I said to myself, I'm sitting behind Oscar. I'm the guy behind the guy. And I said, we got them because they're see value in us. They hear value in us. And so, and it chokes me up because of where guys are today with respect to Durant and those guys. They weren't in the room when it happened. It's like from Hamilton. You want to be in the room where it happens? This is the room where it happened. And Oscar took that step. Now, I want to say to you, Oscar took that step. And in retrospect, Oscar Robertson has never gotten his due from the NBA. He's not a general manager. He's not a president. He's not a coach. He's never any of those things. He did get some TV work, but he was never that guy that reaped the rewards that he should have reaped for putting his neck out there. And I think that there were some owners that held that against him. Mm-hmm. Be that as it may, he enriched a lot of these young men that go to college now. They're so anxious to get to the money now. A guy goes to college a year and he's out.
One and done, right?
That's right. He's one and done. That's the jargon. So, but Oscar is the architect of that. Now, when you talk about Kevin Durant, that's what we fought for. We fought for freedom. And fans don't like it. Think about that. Fans don't like, because they're your players. They belong to you and your imagination. And I'm from an era with the Giants, with Willie Mays and Monty Irvin. Monty Irvin, Mickey Mantle, Duke Snyder, Jackie Robinson. All those guys had to stay at home. You know, they traded Jackie Robinson across the street and people would bananas. Mm-hmm. You know, you can't trade him to the Giants. There's no way. So those things happen if you give players freedom. If you give players freedom, they're going to move, because the advantage, in my opinion, should always be to the player, not the owner. The owner's reaping the benefits of my labor, but where I labor at least should be my choice. And that's what Durant's. I don't like every move that's made, but I didn't hold him in dismay or disdain, actually, for making the move from Oklahoma to Golden State Warriors. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a great move. That's what we fought for. Mm-hmm. You know, rather than you just stay with a franchise where you're unhappy, you're not used properly. If you serve your time, your 2 or 3 years, and you have the right to move, move. And we fought for that. Oscar Robertson literally gave his professional life for that. So I know how fans feel in terms of players leaving and like Durant leaving Brooklyn. But remember, Brooklyn as management got rid of Spencer Dinwiddie and Karis LeVert, some very good players that they were developing. I would have been more upset about that. So I'm not so upset about Kevin, because you kind of know his proclivity. He's kind of like a gypsy. Mm-hmm. That's how he sounds. Like he's always looking over there. You know,
grass is always greener.
Yeah, the grass is always. But he's a great player.
Yes, he is.
So people will open their arms to him, and he should have that right to sell his wares. Now, you know, as you guys are saying, he's selling his wares, but he's under contract. Well, let's read the contract count and see what it allows. They're not going to let him do any more than he's allowed to do. And I don't think some of these things are going to work out, because I don't think teams are anxious to pick up a $41 million contract. I don't believe that, but as they're talking about in Golden State, I think you got to get rid of too many people in order to absorb $41 million. So I think they're a lot better businessmen than we give them credit for.
Coach, I know you've been very gracious about what you got paid when you came into the league, but you see young men today very good players. Obviously, the business is not going to pay them, and God bless them for being able to earn it. But they're walking in at $20-25 million contracts, and some of the big league, really big players are getting paid $50 million a year. So that'll cross your mind personally, number one, and number two, financially, are they going to be responsible? Can a 20-year-old handle the idea and deal with getting paid $25-50 million?
They can if they start out with people like you. If they start out with what you guys offer, yes, that's just a good number. But I always say, the same way you get paid, if you look at the device that's there are people that live among us. Their job is to know how to take your money.
Unfortunately,
and trust me, they find these kids, and they know, I remember Latrell Sprewell living on a boat. I think he had like a 35-foot boat or something. And then he said one day, "I don't have any money." Well, I can see the way you lived, you can't possibly have any money. You're spending thousands of dollars a day just to maintain a boat a day. So that's not, and I think that kids, my advice to them is you should always be meeting with money managers before you sign your first contract to find out if I land here, if this happens, what could you guys do for me? What could you guarantee me? Because it's an educational process. Remember, these are only kids. And it used to be in my group, it was 21 to guys came out of college from 21 to 22, basically. So those guys pretty much were structured financially, but I'm sorry. Those guys were structured, but I lost my thought with the phone.
no worries.
Those kids need advisors, and not just lawyers. In my opinion, they need financial advisors. And I know that's the case because late in my life with my wife, she worked at the University of Michigan and in the healthcare system. And she got a 2-for-1 matching. And she came out with a nice chunk of change. She retired. Mm-hmm. You know why? Money management. Mm-hmm. Money management. And, as I sit here talking to you guys, I hope she doesn't cut me loose because she's got more money than me now,
Hey, Coach, speaking of our business, if I remember correctly, after your MBA days, you spent some time working for a life insurance company. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. But it was Colonial Life and Accident, but the emphasis was on the accident because we were doing ancillary products for people that lived as opposed to, and that's what I loved about that part of the insurance business that I was in. Like the business here, I was talking to live people. I wasn't killing them. What happens when you die? So I got to go in the guy's living room and take him out to get him to buy this policy. I had no interest in that, but I love sitting there talking about what happens if you have an accident, if you're unable to work for 30 days, how long what's your benefits at your job, learning from that perspective and helping somebody from that perspective had great interest to me. So I've done that
Sounds like wealth planning there, Coach.
I'm sorry?
Sounds like wealth planning to me.
Yes. Well, actually, it was really, I don't know if you guys ever heard of Aflac.
Sure.
The duck. The guys that pay people to help them with their bills. We were trying to help people, not enrich them.
Mike, I have plenty of questions, but you want to jump in?
Sure, Dom. I was acquiescing to you. I was turning it over to you, but no problem. So, Coach, what made you write the book now? Which is I'm going to hold up for our audience. What made you write the book almost 50 years later?
My wife and my friend Charlie Rosen. Mm-hmm. Charlie wrote Phil Jackson's book. And so Charlie and I became friends, but he was already friends with Phil. And I liked Phil. I liked the book that he wrote on Phil. And we talked, and I said, "Oh man, you think I got a book in me?" And people have been telling me nobody's interested in a book on Ray Scott. You know, this is nobody's. You know, you're not Julius Erving. You're not some big star, and that's true. That's true. I said, but I lived in a parallel universe. I lived in the NBA and I lived in the United States, and so I saw everything. I was observant of all things on both sides of the coin, and I would like to talk about that. As I go into my 80 octogenarian years, my 80 years, I was like, I have something to say that I believe in, and I think it would help people see the journey of the NBA, because people don't know that Earl Lloyd was the first guy to play in the NBA, that Sweetwater Clifton went to the Knicks and hit from the Globetrotters, or that Chuck Cooper was the first draft choice by the Boston Celtics. He was the #1 draft pick of the Boston Celtics. They don't know that. They know Wilt, they know Russell, they know Oscar, they know Elgin Baylor. But the guys that did the meat, the grinders, the roll guys, people don't know. And they don't know. You heard the saying, oh, he went to a black school, he can't play. Well, try telling that to Earl Monroe. You know? So I wanted to give them that flavor, that history of the NBA, and how schools were segregated up until 1964. I think Baylor was one of the last schools to integrate in Texas. And these schools started integrating, and what do we have now? We have a month, March Madness. The whole country goes crazy for March Madness. That's those kids going to these universities and lifting them up and lifting up the programs. So I'm very pleased, and I sit in awe of what basketball has become in our nation relative to where they started when the NBA was segregated. The universities would say, the ACC, nobody went to school. If you were an African-American, the last place you thought about was Duke, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. You didn't think about going to those schools. Well, look at today. You go to a game today, and one of the most unbelievable things I ever saw, I went to a tournament and I saw Alabama play Auburn. 2 Alabama schools, right? All 10 players on the floor were black. You know what a shock that was to me? That's shocking. These were schools that wouldn't even, until Bear Bryant, nobody even talked about African-American kids. But the great Bear Bryant said, that's ridiculous. We lose all our kids that are born and raised here, and then they go off to California and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and they come back and kill us. He said, gentlemen, I submit to you, that's kind of stupid. And so the Bear was the guy that changed that thought. And he did it by bringing in USC with Sam Bam Cunningham to play in Alabama, and they ran up and down the field in Alabama and Tuscaloosa like they owned it. And he walked off with a smile on his face. He said, now you get the message. And the message was gotten, and Bear was driving it. I'm very proud of that happening in America, that parallel universe in America. In the NBA, that guy was Red Auerbach up in Boston. He's the first gentleman, the first coach to start 5 African-American players back in the 60s. As all of this stuff is going on, all these civil rights marches.
In Boston.
And so forth. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. In Boston. You know, but Red Auerbach is a true hero of, and he wouldn't even know it, but he's a hero of civil rights.
Coach, if I can just tie it back to something you said earlier, and I'd like to really hear your thoughts on this. You clearly were very focused on goal setting as a player. You talked about what things you were looking to achieve, but you also coached, and you coached a lot of young men. Can you talk about the importance of creating those goals for yourself and working hard towards getting them?
You know, my first, oh, I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
No worries, Coach.
I don't have a daughter that, as I said, my girls aren't here.
Good.
It's interesting in coaching for me because I was a coach at 34 years old. And it was like the last thing. It wasn't even on my bucket list to ever be a coach. But you recognize the responsibility, going back to what you're saying, Dom. When do you see that responsibility? And I tried to become a tactician. I tried to teach by tactics and how we would attack and do certain things. So I tried to relate to my players in that way. I think that's good until you get star players. And I coach Hall of Famers. I coach Bob Lanier. I coach Dave Bing. And when you coach Hall of Famers are Hall of Famers because they got a lot of answers. And sometimes those answers collide with what you're trying to do. So it's a tough road to try to coach professional athletes, especially as a young coach. It's even more difficult in college. When I coached in college, what I found out in college coaching, that you're only as good as your recruits. You have to become a great recruiter. If you don't recruit worth a darn, you aren't going to coach. People say, this guy can't coach. Because you can run the most beautiful play in the world, but if the ball doesn't go in the basket at the end of it,
doesn't count.
What's with this guy? He can't do anything. So it's coaching is kind of, I want to say finite, because you're really not management and you're really not a player. You just wind up in that lonely place in between.
And back then, you didn't have a staff of 18 different assistants like they do now.
That's right, Michael. That was incredible, because I did hire an assistant, because I had a friend there in New York named Haskell Cohen, who was a publicist for the NBA. And as a favor to him, I hired somebody. And the lesson I learned from that is you have to be tied into your assistant. You can't take him as a suggestion from someone else. You have to really do your due diligence and make sure you bring in someone that you're philosophically set with. And I don't know how these coaches do it today. They have literally as many coaches on the sideline sometimes as they have players on the team. And, I didn't even have anyone to go have a cup of coffee with, and my trainer told me, he said, find something to do. It was advice I never forgot. He said, as a coach, as a young coach, find something that you can do. Go listen to music, go to a movie, go for a walk, find something to do after you coach. Because if not, what happens to a lot of coaches? They turn to drink.
Mm-hmm.
It solves their wounds, brings down their adrenaline so they can sleep and all of that. But I took Bud Shockro's advice, and I just fell into that thing of I would look for the jazz club in town, go listen to some good jazz and that kind of stuff. I was in Birdland all the time in New York. I couldn't wait.
Well, that's a great place to be.
I'm sorry?
Great place to be.
Yes.
Coach, we're just about out of time. And I guess in closing, you mentioned your trainer. I remember back in the day, we told you before the show that Dom and I were big Knick fans. They used to joke around that Danny Whalen was Red Holtzman's assistant coach, because he was the trainer and he was the only guy who sat next to Red, who wasn't a player back in those days.
That's right. That's right. And Red was there by himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Having an assistant.
So for Coach, for us, this was a great walk down memory lane growing up during that era. And I'll let Dom say goodbye as well, but I cannot thank you enough for the time you've given us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike.
I think we just touched the tip of the iceberg, Coach, and I'd love to hear your advice going forward, especially for young players who are multi-millionaires and need to be responsible with that. And, they all don't go to the Hall of Fame, right? So it's really important at this young age to be responsible. So I'd love to hear your words of wisdom on a future podcast.
Well, I hope you have me back.
Love to have it. Thank you.
You will. Once again, the name of the book is The NBA in Black and White, the memoir of a trailblazing NBA player and coach. And that's our show. Coach, we didn't even take another break. We just held you the whole time. So thank you again. And Dominic and I will see you back here again next week. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Coach.
Thank you.